Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. It's wonderful to be back together. And I'm going to place us in the prophet Amos in just a moment. But what I'd like to say first about him is that he is known, though many of the prophets could have this title, he in particular is seen as the social justice prophet. And I wanted to just give you two examples here at the beginning of our learning of how the words of Amos, the ancient words of this prophet, have in a few ways made their way into what has become, I suggest, the American canon. So in Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech from 1963. Part of that speech is, there are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that, of course, is a direct quote from the prophet Amos, Kemaim mishpat utzdaka kinachal etan, from Amos 5:24. But let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. And in a less well-known speech that the host Krista Tippett of On Being, for those of you who are followers of hers and that program, she quoted a sermon that Dr. King also preached, but this one at Temple Israel Hollywood in the 60s. And so to the Temple Israel Hollywood community, he said, and anyway, in this he called for, he said, maybe the world is in need of the formation of a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Men and women who will be as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day would cry out in words that echo across the centuries, as maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free, and on and on. And so I just want to stay with that image for a moment from Dr. King of the prophet Amos, but perhaps really to be thinking about all of our prophets in some way as being maladjusted. What does it mean that they are maladjusted? They are maladjusted to the values of their surrounding society because they are in alignment with the divine will and the divine vision. And so they see only too clearly the difference between the divine will and the current social structure. Amos is, of course, one of the 12 minor prophets, known as a minor prophet, not because he has less influence or he's less important. The minor prophets, as we mentioned before, are so grouped simply because their books are much shorter. And so they are grouped together. He was actually probably, according to scholars, the first of the biblical prophets in the Nevi'im cycle, in the prophet's book, right? So he preceded Isaiah. He preceded Jeremiah. He preceded Ezekiel. He was active during 760 to 755 BCE, somewhere in that period. And scholars believe he was a contemporary, an older contemporary of Hosea and Isaiah. So he too was active during the rules of kings Jeroboam and Uzziah. He was from the southern kingdom, but interestingly, he preached in the northern kingdom. So he wasn't of Israel, he was from Judah, but his prophecy in general is addressed to the northern kingdom of Israel. So it's somewhat interesting or ironic that in this last of our sessions with My Jewish Learning to focus on a single prophet, we'll have an exciting session next week with both Rabbi Bernstein and myself, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But this is our last session in the series to focus on one prophet, and yet it feels important to emphasize that he was really the first one. And so a lot of the themes that you'll see that look like repeating themes, well, Amos was probably the first one to say it, right? So he was influencing everything that came after. One thing also to know about the context of the book of Amos, prophesying to the northern kingdom of Israel, is that in the time when he was prophesying, it was a time of plenty, a time of security. It was a golden age. And so you can imagine that the people were really not interested in listening to him. In this golden age of plenty, relative plenty, and relative security, however, what is true is that there is increasing wealth disparity. The rich are getting richer, but the poor are getting poorer. And one of the main themes of this book is that that is not a natural evolution in the society, according to the book of Amos, but that is actually the result of corruption and exploitation by the political, judicial, and religious leaders of the time. They are exploiting their power for personal gain and inflicting suffering on the poor. You can imagine then how a prophet who is maladjusted to these social values and is in alignment with the divine will, you can imagine how he feels about the not only neglect but exploitation of the orphan, of the widow, of the poor. And so, as we've done for every prophet thus far, we're going to just look at the very first verses. In this literature, we see that almost always, if not always, the first lines are really contextualizing where we are and often giving us themes or images to understand the entire book. And so that is true as well for Amos. I will share my screen in just one moment. Let me enlarge it. So you can see my nice picture of a lion roaring. That's going to be an image that we'll see a few times here. And I brought the Hebrew in for these early verses. Divrei Amos. I wanted to just point out that, like Jeremiah, this book begins with the words of the prophet. More often we see Divrei Hashem, the words of God coming to the prophet. But in both of these books, we have a more direct beginning, where these are the words or the speech of the prophet themselves. And I want to take just a moment to think about the name Amos or Amos. First of all, you may notice that it is somewhat unusual. This is a book, a prophet. It will be among the first that do not have a name of God in their names, like Isaiah, Yeshayahu, right? Or Ezekiel, El, right? Jeremiah, Yah, right? Amos is a secular word, right? It doesn't even have like the salvation of Hosea, right? Amos, what does Amos mean? Amos comes from a verb root that has the cluster of meanings of to be laden, to be loaded, even to carry a burden. And as we're introduced to Amos the prophet, right, his name actually may reflect his role. Perhaps his role in this book is to carry a load, right? And given what we've looked before at the scholar Dr. Yochanan Muffs of blessed memory, what is that load? What is that burden he is carrying? We could say it is both the load of the repentance, the tshuva of the people, but also it's the load, it's the weight of this divine vision, right? And so the load of Amos might be the load of the prophet, is to hold the vision of the divine and the reality of the people at the same time. Okay, we've done the first two words. We're moving right along. I'm going to stop for questions after we get through just this first part. Divrei Amos asher haya ben nokdim. Okay, so the words of Amos that came to us in nokdim, banokdim, in among the sheep breeders. Nokdim are seen as sheep breeders. There are some other ideas about what it could be, but in general, most people think it has something to do with sheep breeding. There is a big question, however, whether he is a sheep breeder himself or whether he might be an owner or the leader of a conglomerate of sheep breeders, right? And part of the ambiguity is in the Hebrew, haya banokdim. He was among the sheep breeders. Does that mean he was one, or that he had sort of kind of, like the union representative of them, or the owning class, the one who supervised and leased the work from the sheep breeders? We'll get into that perhaps in a bit. And where were they? In Tekoa. Tekoa, which is a village outside the environs of Jerusalem, near Bethlehem, who saw visions, asher chazah, right? So we have this specific word, chazah, chazyon, of visions, who saw visions, al Yisrael, about Israel, concerning Israel, b'yamei Uzziah melech Yehuda, uv'yamei Yerovoam ben Yoash melech Yisrael. So now we're getting the timing again. So the kingdoms both of Israel and Judah are both in existence at this time with these kings. And then here's an interesting ending to the verse, especially for me, who I am teaching here from Berkeley, not far from, an earthquake fault line, the San Andreas Fault. It says it is shnatayim lifnei hara'ash, 2 years before the big noise, or ra'ash is also an earthquake. And just a note to say that we've heard about this earthquake from other prophets, Isaiah and Zechariah. And this apparently, we have this evidence that there was an enormous earthquake around 750 BCE. And so in our own time of many different natural disasters, and certainly pandemic, one thing to be also aware of is what prophecy might feel like or sound like to a place that is enjoying relative prosperity, but has in their muscle memory, right, in their emotional lives, this experience of chaos and terror that was unleashed from the very earth. And because the imagery of the earth is so prominent in this book, I think it's an important note before we actually look at what this prophet's images are going to be to deliver the message of God are, and to think about how something like an earthquake might influence it. And so to that very point, if we look at the second verse, and he said, the Lord from Zion roars, right? So you get right at the beginning this kind of audio visual sense, right? There's this sound of the earthquake followed right by God roaring. And from Jerusalem puts forth his voice, and the shepherds' meadows wither, and the peak of Carmel dries up. Thus said the Lord, for 3 trespasses of Damascus, and for 4 I will not turn it back, for their threshing Gilead with iron threshing boards. Okay, so I just read English, but some of you might be thinking, I have no idea what that means, right? Those are words that I understand individually, but strung together, what does that actually mean? And I want to just say about that this is a rhetorical strategy. This for 3 trespasses and for 4, I will not turn it back. If you look down the sheet, you can see it's in verse 6, verse 9, verse 11, verse 13, into chapter 2, verse 1, verse 4, verse 6, verse 7. It happens 8 times right at the beginning of the book, this saying, for 3 trespasses of blank, and for 4, I will not turn it back. And so what he's building up is the fact that there have continually been sins in each of the surrounding neighbors of Israel and Judah. That's chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. And that God is about to reach a limit. 3, okay. But 4, you've gone too far. That's the place of no return. And you notice we start with Damascus, go to Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammonites, Moab, and then and only then does the prophet turn the lens back on to Bnei Yisrael, to the children of Israel, both in Judah and in Israel, and says the same thing. for 3 trespasses of Judah in verse 4 of the 2nd chapter, and for 4, I will not turn it back. And now, what are the kind of trespasses he is naming? For their spurring the Lord's teaching, God's statutes they did not keep, for their false things led them astray, after which their fathers had gone. Idol worship, not listening to God. And then in verse 6, for 3 trespasses of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For they're selling the just man for silver, and the needy for sandals. Here's the exploitation we were talking about, who trample the head of the needy to the dust of the ground and pervert the way of the poor. And so we are seeing here an interesting rhetorical strategy where the prophet, with this repetition of this for 3 and for 4, right, is building up suspense, but at the same time, he's allowing the people of Israel to be thinking, yeah, those people are bad. Yeah, they're going to get it. Yeah, God's going to get them. And then only after all of the surrounding nations, then Amos turns the most withering lens on Judah and Israel itself and says, not only are you not escaping this, but your crimes are crimes that make God very, very upset. And just one more note about this rhetorical strategy. You may have noticed this 3 and 4 repeating. One commentator noted that 3 plus 4, of course, adds up to 7, which is the number of completion, of Shabbat, of holiness, right? And so for 3, I won't let this happen, but at 4, you put them together and we will have Kedusha, we will have holiness again. All right, this is a good stopping place. I know I've just shared, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I know that's been a lot, but I am open to your questions. If it looks, yes, Rabbi, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just have to unmute you. There you go.
There I am. Thank you. Yeah, just what strikes me, 3 is a countable number. 4, Arba'ah, is related to Rav, many. As long as we can count it, it's okay. When it becomes many, then we get the punishment.
Wonderful. Yes, exactly. There's a sense, right?
Also,
and there's a sense in Judy.
A typo, shouldn't that have been spurning rather than spurring?
Where is that?
You have spurring the Lord's teachings. Should be spurning the Lord's teachings.
Could be.
I think that's a typo from Sefaria.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. Yes, and just a note that I will not turn it back in Hebrew is lo ashivenu, which is the same word, the same root as tshuva, right? If you don't return, then I can't return you, right? Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, then, oh, yes, Barry.
There were also a couple of questions in the chat box after Barry.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, in verses 6, 9, 11, 13, and 2, 1, you don't list what the sins are, and I assume that they're not listed in Tanakh. But when we talk about Judah and Israel, we do. What laws are the other kingdoms violating, and what laws are they responsible for because they are not part of the covenant?
Thank you so much for asking that question, Barry. They are listed. And I put the dots, the ellipses there just because I wasn't, able to print out the whole book, but I highly recommend you go back And you'll see that each of them has a verse or two, right, to specify what each place is doing. And that's an excellent point, that it's not only the people Israel that can disappoint God, right? We sometimes think that, like with our 613 mitzvot, we're the only ones who are responsible to God. But of course, there are at the very least 7 Noahide Commandments, right, for all peoples to follow in our Torah. So the other societies can also act against God, but it does, as we will see in just a moment, have a special resonance and valence for God and for Israel when we are not following our own covenant, the terms of our own covenant. Thanks for that question. All right.
And someone asked, could you, why are iron threshing boards such a bad thing?
Yes. So that's an excellent question, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about exactly what that is. Let me actually give you, let's see, I thought I had my page here, but if you'll just wait 1 second. Oh, this was the wrong one. I think it has to do with just the harshness of the iron, but I wasn't focusing on the trespasses of Damascus. As you'll see, I'm looking more deeply into to Judah and Israel. But excellent question. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. I think we're going to move on so we can see some more of this wonderful, wonderful writing. So Amos chapter 3 is where we're going to go next. Oh, I did want to point out one other thing just about his name. In Leviticus Rabbah, in the Midrash, the legends about Amos, there's a very interesting idea of how he got his calling, right? Because unlike Jeremiah, we don't have a story of how God came to him. We just start out with him doing his prophecies. But the Midrash wants to fill that in, and they have a whole idea of how that happened. But the main thing I want to pull from that Midrash is actually, some say that Amos had a speech defect like Moses. So Moses and Amos were both challenged with their speech, even though they were the mouth of God to the people, right? And Rabbi Pinchas said, why was he called Amos? Because he was Amos Bilshono. Amos Bilshono, he was laden of tongue. His tongue was heavy. His tongue was burdened, like Moses. So we have a parallel there as well. Okay. Only one other thing I want to say before we move on to chapter 3, which is that Amos distinguishes himself as well. He is the only prophet for whom a profession is assigned. So what does it mean here that he is a sheep breeder? Some say it means that it shows he's not, certainly a priest. And we'll see later in the book that he has conflict with the priests, right? But that he is explicitly being seen as a man of the earth. And though some commentators say that he might have been the wealthy owner of many sheep or an overseer of many shepherds, there's an idea here, and we'll see it a few times, hopefully. And again, look at the imagery, that this this prophet, unlike others who are working in an intellectual sphere, he is positioning himself as a man of the earth and a man who knows what it's like to live in the natural cycles of the earth and to tend them, along with others who do the same. Okay, so chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 are on your sheet. I will share my screen in just a moment. Here we go. Hear this word, O people of Israel, that the Lord has spoken concerning you, concerning the whole family that I brought up from Egypt. That should be from Egypt, not from the Egypt, saying, only with you was I intimate of all the clans of the earth. This reminds me of what we studied both with Jeremiah and Hosea, this language of intimacy, this love language. We see chosenness here, chosenness of a special relationship. Only with you was I intimate of all the clans of the earth. Therefore, I will make a reckoning with you for all your crimes. And just noting that it's because of the special love relationship that it is important for God to make this reckoning, that we need this reckoning in order to be able to continue to be in relationship. And here is this feeling of intimacy again. Do two walk together if they have not first agreed? Right? The intimacy of two walking together on a path. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel says that the prophet regards himself as one who walks with God. God and he have agreed, right? And so this could be seen as Moses' intimate relationship with the divine. But of course, it's also the people Israel, right, as a possibility. And notice that we're entering in for the rest of this selection, all the way through verse 8, another rhetorical strategy, just like we had that very literary strategy of repetition in chapters 1 and 2. Here, we're going to have the repetition of questions, right? Do two walk together if they have not first agreed? Does the lion roar in the forest unless it has taken prey? Does the maned beast put forth its voice from its lair if it has not made a catch? Does a bird that should be fall. Does a bird fall into a trap on the ground when there is no snare for it? Does a trap spring up from the soil and fail to make a catch? Is a ram's horn sounded in the town and the people do not tremble? Is there harm within the town and the Lord has not done it? For the master, the Lord, does nothing without revealing God's secret to God's servants, the prophets. A lion roars. Who does not fear? The master, the Lord, speaks. Who cannot prophesy or prophesy, right? And so we can notice so many things about the really amazing livriyut, the really amazing quality of this writing as writing. First of all, these questions that build on themselves, but also, again, we've got roars and horns, right, that are causing trembling, right? The audio nature of this. And then also the animals and the lion and the beast and the bird and the trap in the soil. Again, this is bringing us far away from the buildings of society, the Beit Midrash or the temple, and we're outdoors in a safari, right? In a world of dynamic action, and this is the most important piece, that is highly regulated by cause and effect. This happens, then that happens. Isn't it so? Isn't it so that if this happens, that will happen too? Isn't it so that if this happens, that has already happened, right? That this leads to that. A lion roars, everyone's terrified. And when God speaks, the prophecy must pour out. The point of this really beautiful poetry is the causality of God's power, omnipotence, and omniscience, where we have a series here of 7 sayings, all expressed in the form of rhetorical questions whose answers are all in the negative. Nothing transpires by accident or happenstance. And the rhetorical strategy of these questions is, some suggest, a strategy with a self-satisfied audience to try to open them to consider something else, to consider things that they don't want to see. All right, any questions on this section?
Someone asked what translation you're using.
Thank you. Part of the problem is that I, with the typos for which I apologize, is that I was using mainly the Safaria translation, but also bringing in a little bit of Robert Alter's magnificent translation, which I highly recommend as well. So it's a little bit of a mixture. Okay.
And I think Deanne had a question.
Sure.
Or a comment.
So when we were reading verse 2, and we were discussing the 3 and but 4, it brought to mind Genesis 15:16 and the promise made to Abraham when the cutting of the pieces occurred. And I'm going to reduce this window. And after the cutting of the pieces, Hashem says, but you will come to your forefathers in peace. You will be buried in a good old age. And the 4th generation will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites will not be complete until then. So it seems like when Amos is talking about this, he's talking about the completion of their sin and this promise. And then when we go into chapter 3, which you just read, he reminds us when he brought us out of Egypt, which is what Genesis 15 is talking about, is that we're going to be slaves in Egypt. And then he goes on to say that he would not do anything without telling his prophets first, which seems to be alluding back to Abraham to me. And the Rashi comments say about this idea, I'm just going to add one sentence, and the 4th generation, after they will have been exiled to Egypt, they will be there for 3 generations, and the 4th will return to the land. But then when it comments on Rashi about the Amorites will not be complete, which is what really brought this to my mind, the 3 sins, and then for 4, for the iniquity of the Amorites will not be complete. And Rashi says that they should be sent out of their land until that time. This would be the Amorites. For the Holy One, blessed be he, does not punish a nation until its measure is full, as it is said in Isaiah 27:8, when her measure is full, when you send her away, then you will strive with her. And then it has a citation from the Zohar. Do you see any connection between Amos' prophecy alluding back to Abraham in this instance about this fullness of the sins of the nations?
Well, first of all, Deanne, Yishar Kochech, that was beautiful. And thank you for bringing all of those texts. Look, all of these texts are in conversation with one another, first of all, right? And it is totally part of what we do to bring these texts back into conversation, and that's how we continue to create new Torah, right? And that's one of the things that is so exciting, that's such an available path for us to continue to create new Torah by just connecting up different things from different times and teachers. And so Abraham can be speaking directly to and through Amos, right? That's how we work in our tradition. And yet, this feels important to say, at the same time that all of that is true, we don't construct it philosophically as an idea that whatever happened back at Abraham's time, all of this is just a fulfillment of it that can't be escaped, right? The whole idea of Judaism, and certainly of the prophetic narrative and purpose, is to say, this is what's going to happen. This is the natural consequence if you continue on this path. But there is always tshuva, right? And so then we have the beautiful saying, in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Ancestors, right? Hakol tzafui v'reshut netuna, that like everything is foreseen, and yet you have free will, right? How can those two things be true? How can it be true that God knows exactly what's going to happen? It's already done. And yet we still can change. We can still act, in the world and create new possibility. And for certainly the rabbinic tradition, that's where all of the dynamism comes from, with taking everything that's happened extraordinarily seriously and believing that it is setting us on a pattern, but also knowing at any moment that that new pathways can be forged. And I love, your whole set of comments is an example of how actually just bringing the ancient together into conversation, in its different periods, we actually create something new, right? And as long as we have this idea that we are creating something new / uncovering something that was always there, but not a servant, to a determinism, right? That the prophets are coming to tell us, you always have choice. Yes. And I see Moshe has something he wants to say. Thank you, Deanne. Oh, Moshe, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
It says, Al Shlishim ve'al Levi'im. I mean, the Maimonides actually explains it, that if 4 generations collectively, the children do not atone to the sins of the fathers, they will be punished. So 3 generations is a giving, but in the 4th one, if you do not atone, the sin then becomes yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Moshe. I see Yossi, and then after Yossi, I'm going to move on because there's still a bunch of text I'm hoping we're going to see. Go ahead, Yossi.
Okay. I've been listening to all these sessions. I've attended all the sessions, and I've been trying to make sense out of all of it. I'm looking for a common thread. And today I think I found it, especially through Amos. And that is that what this teshuvah and Betzalim Elohim and repairing the world is all about social justice. I'm beginning to understand why the whole history of the Jewish people from way back till now points towards social justice. It seems to me, this is the burden that Amos is carrying.
Beautiful. Thank you, Yossi.
The injustice of the world.
You just gave me a great segue I'm going to take it. Thank you. So, so if we look at the next text, right, which is from chapter 5, this becomes explicit for any people who might think that Judaism or religion is all about what happens when you go to shul or just your sacrifices in the temple. Amos, of course, reminding you that he was the first one, right, to say these things. And, you know, in the Nevi'im portion of our Tanakh says, I spurn your festivals and smell no fragrance in your convocations. Should you offer up to me burnt offerings or grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I look on the well-being sacrifice of your fatted calves. Take away from me the noise of your singers, nor will I listen to the melody of your lutes. Here's the king quote, but let justice well up like water and righteousness like a steady stream. Did you bring me sacrifices and grain offering in the wilderness 40 years, house of Israel? And you shall carry off your king, Sikut and Kiyun, the images you have made for yourselves of your star gods, and I will exile you beyond Damascus, said the Lord, God of Israel, in God's name. So we're seeing we're seeing this utter rejection of ritual not informed by ethical concern, right? The ritual alone is not what God wants. And they're doing the ritual as they're still doing avodah zarah, as they're still engaged in idol worship. If we went to chapter 7, which I'm going to mostly skip over, there's an amazing story of Amos the prophet in conflict with Amaziah, a priest, right? And where we see that the priest is completely complicit, right, in all kinds of things that are not going well, and in the priestly exploitation of the poor as well. And Amaziah basically is banishing Amos, saying, "Get out of here! Stop prophesying." And let's just say Amos doesn't take it. He rejects Amaziah's authority, and he continues to speak for God. And I want to make sure that we get to the end of the book, because Yossi is exactly right. You know, some people say that, oh, tikkun olam, this whole idea of social justice in the Torah, this was invented by those liberals, and in the contemporary period, but we can see, right? What do the prophets care about, right? They're constantly reminding us to do what God asked us to do, which over and over, we don't need to wait for the prophets. In the Chumash itself, in the first 5 books of the Torah, we see over and over, take care of the widow, take care of the orphan, care for the poor, the stranger, the foreigner, right? And also, our prophets, beyond just calling us in or out, they offer us a vision of healing and of consolation. They say, it's going to get bad. We have to face everything we've done wrong, and that's going to be really hard. It includes real consequences. But the reason we're doing it, to go back to chapter 3, is because we have this intimate bond. Because we, as the people Israel and God, have a covenant. And in order to keep the covenant, we have to do this work. But on the other side of that is so much beauty and so much healing. And so we listen to Amos as he closes the book. Amos with only 9 chapters. Look, days are coming, said the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes the sower of seed, and the mountains shall drip fermented juice, and all the hills shall melt. And I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild ruined cities and dwell there, and plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall make gardens and eat their fruit. Again, the focus on the earthiness, the connection to the earth. I want to suggest that Amos, and there were many other verses we didn't get to look like, who is known as the social justice prophet, might also be the environmentalist prophet. He is constantly talking about getting back into touch and into good relationship with the earth itself. And thus, in the last verse, I will plant them on their soil, and they shall be no more uprooted from their soil that I have given them, said the Lord your God. This beautiful conclusion of connection into soil, because if we take that image and we extend it to imagine what does it mean for us to be planted in our soil, we can see the roots spreading into the soil and growing, right? We can see the progression of the health of that dynamic relationship as reestablishing itself and growing. The miracle of the consolation and the possibility of rejuvenation, of literally regeneration, replanting. And I just want to share with you, again, I put it at the end of the sheets. There are two poems I gave you that were written by the poet Margaret Walker, who I had not been familiar with before. But Margaret Walker was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1915. She was the first African-American poet to receive the Yale Younger Poets Prize. And she has two different Amos poems. I'm just going to read the first one. Amos, 1963. Amos is a shepherd of suffering sheep, a pastor preaching in the depths of Alabama, preaching social justice to the Southland, preaching to the poor a new gospel of love with the words of a God and the dreams of a man. Amos is our loving shepherd of the sheep, crying out to the stricken land, you have sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. My God is a mighty avenger, and he shall come with his rod in his hand, preaching to the persecuted and the disinherited millions, preaching love and justice to the solid southern land. Amos is a prophet with a vision of brotherly love, with a vision and a dream of the red hills of Georgia, when justice shall roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amos is our shepherd standing in the shadow of our God, tending his flocks all over the hills of Albany and the seething streets of Selma and of bitter Birmingham. Of course, in this poem, she is comparing Amos to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I would suggest she's daring us to apply the words of Amos to the year 1963. And I wanted to suggest that maybe that's a dare we should offer ourselves in the year of 2021. How would Amos and his International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment, right? How should we be viewing and evaluating and interacting with this actual world that we are a part of, given the divine vision that we are stewards of and continuers of the covenant with?